And it was, when I say the score, I don't mean like a commercially printed score. I mean the score for the movie with John Williams' handwritten notations on it.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, well, not that far away, the year was 1992, and composer Paul Webb, then an employee of game developer Sculptured Software, was putting the finishing touches on the sounds that would encompass Super Star Wars. It was the first game in a trilogy of LucasArts team titles for the Super Nintendo that would go on to become fan favorites for Nintendo and Star Wars fans alike, earned some pretty neat placements in Nintendo Power and sold copies worldwide, with the first installment becoming a player's choice title. But arguably one of the cooler achievements of Super Star Wars wasn't just experiencing Luke Skywalker's adventures for yourself on the SNES. It was how Webb, who got his Star Wars start in the NES's Empire Strikes Back just a year earlier, managed to fit all of that intergalactic noise and legendary score on a 16-bit cartridge. In honor of May 4th, Star Wars Day as many know it, I'm sharing some highlights from a recent chat with Paul, who was gracious enough to reflect on that period of time of his life with me, the moment he put his hands on John Williams' original Empire score, and the feeling of knowing his contributions have been felt by retro gamers in the decades since. Here's the music of Super Star Wars with composer Paul Webb.
You know, I started working with Sculptured Software back in the late 80s. And this was back when PCs didn't have sound cards and they had a little tiny speaker. I was pretty cocky. I didn't have really any programming experience. I just knew I'd taught myself programming. And I was interviewing for a programming job, and he said, I see, you know, you've got a lot of music background. We've got these games that we've been looking to find somebody to do some music for a while. You want to do that? And I was like, yeah, that sounds good. And back then, they had me, they actually had me using the assembly language code of the game, and I would put values into a little code database, and they'd incorporate it, you know, directly into the code. And that's how I, you know, wrote little melodies. And so very primitive. And I wrote a little, I made up a little text-based music language so I could make it easier to write music. One of my early games was for the Commodore 64 and stuff like that. So, you know, it was the very early gaming world at that time. You know, you could only do a very limited amount for the NES. And what I did in order to figure out how to make it sound as good as you can is I had a sampling keyboard where I could digitally sample sounds, and I sampled the sounds of the NES chip, and I put them onto my sampling keyboard. Then I composed using those actual sounds. So I figured out how to make it sound, you know, as good as I could just by dinking around. It felt more like another job, really, because I mean, there was just not that much you could do. I mean, you couldn't on the NES sound chip, you couldn't do a whole score. You know, you couldn't do a full orchestral arrangement. You could just do a few bleeps and blips, and you know, it was like, I can't remember, 2 or 3 channels, 2 or 3 voices. So I mean, there's only so much you could do, and there was no nuance. It was just like, you know. Yeah, I'm sure it was very primitive, you know. I may be misremembering, but I think it was when I was doing the NES Empire. they sent me the score for the movie, and it was, when I say the score, I don't mean like a commercially printed score. I mean the score for the movie with John Williams handwritten notations on it. But I was like, look, look, it's the Holy Grail. This was very unusual that I actually had not only a score, but the score. I can make it sound, you know, much closer to what the actual score sounded like. I had 8 voices to work with. I could use digitally sampled, musical instruments, and uh, yeah, in fact, uh, I discovered eventually that my music score for the Super Star Wars was groundbreaking. It was something nobody had ever heard before on a Super Nintendo. Uh, because the thing that made me somebody in video game industry is I knew the technical side of it. I could program in assembly language. I understood the hardware. I understood the limitations and the capabilities of the physical hardware, and I understood music, and I understood how audio worked. And so I could put the two together and make it work within some very severe technical limitation. On the Super Nintendo, everything that had to be, that was going to be able to play or sound at the same time had to fit into 64K. 64 meg is 1,000 times 64K. And the standard now is 1,000 times more than that. Like gigabytes of memory is normal now, which is like literally a million times more. So I had to fit it into this, minuscule amount of memory, and not just the music, but all the sound effects and the sound driver and all the data for the music. All I had to fit into 64K. So it was a challenge, to say the least, to make it work. And I came up with a lot of things that were probably pretty innovative to squeeze a whole bunch of orchestral sampled musical instruments into this little tiny space. The projects came individually. So there was the there was the NES Empire, and then later on there was the Super Star Wars, and then Super Empire came quite a long time after that, and Super Jedi came a long time after that. The difference between Nintendo and Super Nintendo, it was a huge difference of capability. So, and not only the severe limitations of the NES, but the fact that the NES was just simple synthesis, whereas the Super Nintendo allowed you to do digital sampling. And so, huge difference. And the NES, you could do like 2 or 3 channels of audio, whereas the Super Nintendo, you could do 8 channels of audio. So huge differences. One of the pieces that I spent a lot of time arranging was the closing credits sequence. And the programmer for the game really liked that arrangement that I came up with. And he didn't like the fact that it might only ever be heard when people played the end credits after they'd won the game. And so of course, with cart type games, when you pause the game, something will play while it's paused. And so he made that the music that would play during the pause. So that was fun. That became a big piece of the experience of listening to that. is kind of funny and ironic. I wasn't that huge a gamer myself. So it wasn't like when, as soon as the game released, I ran out to the store and said, "Oh, here's my game here." At that time, the magazine Nintendo Power was a big deal. And they would feature a game on the cover of Nintendo Power magazine. And that particular month or whatever it was, Super Star Wars was featured. And not only, and normally they would feature the programmer, but in this case, they also featured me and my audio team. And that was a first. And so, and then we got a plaque, and the Sculpture Software received a plaque for it from Nintendo. And normally they would just put the name of the programmer on it, but they, put me and my assistant Mark Gaines on that plaque. So it was a big deal at the time. After Super Star Wars came out, and if I mentioned to somebody that I did the music, they were like, "Wow, you did the music for Star Wars? I play that all the time. That's so cool," and all this kind of stuff. And I still get that sometimes from people, like yourself, who are fans of, the old retro stuff, that are like, "Oh, you did Star Wars? Oh my gosh, Super Star Wars!" So I get that, periodically now, still today. I tried to get it as close as I could, all that stuff. Yeah, in fact, the programmer, this was long before DVDs, but the programmer of the Super Star Wars had one of the early Laserdisc players, and he had all three Star Wars movies on Laserdisc. And I had a digital audio tape recorder, and I recorded the entire soundtrack to digital audio tape, and I would just listen and say, "Okay, that's how it sounded like." Without the visuals, I was like, I can picture the whole movie just by listening to the sound. It was all there. Everything was there. It was just, it was pretty amazing, I thought. And so, yeah, I tried to make it as close as possible. Some of the sound effects, I don't remember which ones anymore, but there were some of the sound effects where I got recordings of the actual sound effects, and then was able to use those directly, the actual visual recordings of that. I mean, it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was a really fun way to make a living, and Sculptured Software at that time was a really fun place to work, because everybody. I mean, everybody was having fun doing what they wanted to do, and it's not like the way the video game industry has become so corporatized. It was like you could work when you want, any time of the day or night, and come in when you wanted to. As long as you got your work done, nobody really cared to say, "Oh, you weren't at your desk this morning at 8 o'clock." Star Wars, the Star Wars games were by far my favorite games to work on.